Hey there, sleepyheads, glad to have you back. Before we slip into tonight's tale, I'd love to know where in the world you're watching from, and what time it is for you right now. Oliver was born during a thunderstorm that forgot to thunder, leaving only gentle rain and the soft percussion of water against windows. His first sound wasn't a cry, but a quiet hum that seemed to harmonize with the storm's whisper. The midwife, an elderly woman named Iris who had delivered half the town over 4 decades, paused in her careful work and tilted her head, listening. She had heard thousands of newborns announce their arrival, but never had she encountered a sound quite like this, not demanding or urgent, but somehow ancient, as if this tiny being had brought music from wherever souls wait before birth. Maya and Thomas leaned closer, watching their son with wonder as that ethereal humming drifted up from the bundle in Iris's weathered arms. The sound wasn't loud, barely audible above the rain tapping against the bedroom windows, but it filled the small cottage with something that felt like peace settling into every corner. Iris wrapped Oliver carefully, her movements slower now, more reverent, as if she recognized she was handling something precious and rare. When she placed him in Maya's arms, the humming continued, soft and steady as a heartbeat, and Maya felt warmth spread outward from where her son rested against her chest. The house itself seemed to respond to Oliver's presence. In the days that followed, the old radiator sighed more gently. The kitchen clock softened its tick. Even the kettle, when it boiled, held back from its usual sharp whistle, as though it didn't wish to interrupt. Thomas, who had never considered himself a particularly sensitive man, found that the worried knot between his shoulders would simply dissolve when Oliver hummed. Maya discovered that her new mother anxieties would fade into something manageable, something she could breathe through. Word spread in the way quiet things do. Neighbors found themselves drawn to visit more often than usual, though none could quite articulate why. Mrs. Peterson from next door, who rarely socialized beyond polite waves, appeared with casseroles and stayed for tea, lingering longer than social convention required. The mailman began taking time to chat about the weather, the garden, anything that would extend his time near the house. Even the neighborhood cats gathered in the yard, not with hunting energy, but with the peaceful stillness of creatures who had found an inexplicably perfect spot for afternoon naps. Nights were gentler in that house. Sometimes Maya and Thomas would wake to check on Oliver and find themselves already calmer than they had been moments before. They made tea and shared small sandwiches over the cradle, speaking in whispers not from fear of waking him, but because the room seemed to ask for reverence. The rain returned in scattered visits, bringing its slow music, and Oliver's hum found it every time, the way rivers find their own paths. Once, during an evening when dusk painted the sky in soft blues, a scent of lavender drifted through the open window from somewhere down the street. Maya smiled, thinking of her own grandmother and gardens that come alive after dark. Oliver turned his head toward that fragrance with attention older than words, seeming to listen beyond the room, past rain and clock and kettle, toward something with petals and patient roots. In that moment, Maya had the oddest feeling that his humming was answering something outside, something that opened only when the rest of the world grew quiet, something that had been waiting for him all along. That lavender scent had drifted from 3 houses down, where Nana Rose tended a garden that seemed to exist in its own pocket of perpetual twilight. When Oliver was 18 months old, and his wordless humming had evolved into soft, meandering songs that followed no earthly melody, Maya began carrying him through the back gate each evening as the sun painted the sky in gentle watercolors. The path between their houses had worn smooth from decades of neighborly visits, but now it felt like something more, a bridge between the ordinary world and a place where different rules applied. Nana Rose was always waiting, as if she had been expecting them long before Maya knocked. Her silver hair caught light even in the gathering dusk, braided with sprigs of rosemary that released their fragrance when she moved. Her hands carried the permanent perfume of soil and growing things, and when she lifted Oliver from Maya's arms, he settled against her shoulder with the easy trust of someone who had found exactly where he belonged. His evening songs grew softer in her presence, becoming something more like conversation than performance. The garden revealed itself slowly, the way all important things do. During those first visits, Oliver's attention wandered to ordinary wonders, how shadows moved across the grass like gentle creatures, the way water caught moonlight in the small fountain and tossed it back in silver coins, the particular rustle leaves made when they whispered secrets only they could understand. But as weeks turned to months, Nana Rose began guiding his gaze toward the corners where quiet magic lived. She showed him the patch where night-blooming flowers waited patiently through daylight hours, their buds closed tight as sleeping eyes. Evening primrose stood shoulder to shoulder with 4 o'clocks. Moonflowers twined around shepherd's hooks that Thomas had built years before Oliver was born. A night-blooming jasmine cascaded from wooden trellises like fragrant waterfalls. These flowers, Nana Rose explained in the gentle voice she reserved for important truths, understood something most people had forgotten. They knew that some of the most beautiful things in the world only revealed themselves when the rest of the world was ready to sleep. As twilight deepened, Oliver would watch in wonder as the first buds began their slow unfurling. The evening primrose opened like tiny suns setting in reverse, their yellow petals catching the last light and holding it tenderly. 4 o'clocks bloomed precisely as their name promised, as if they carried tiny clocks in their stems that knew exactly when the world was ready for their particular beauty. The moonflowers were Oliver's favorites, great white trumpets that opened with almost audible sighs, releasing fragrance so sweet it seemed to have weight. From the wooden bench where they sat together, Nana Rose would help Oliver listen to the garden's nighttime symphony. Wind chimes sang soft metal lullabies from the apple tree. Leaves rustled their ancient conversations. An owl somewhere in the distance offered its patient questions to the darkness. And underneath it all, Oliver's humming found its place, weaving through the garden's music like thread through fabric, like a voice that had always belonged to this choir. It was on a night when the moon hung thin as a silver comma that Oliver first consciously tended. A single moonflower held itself closed longer than the others, as if uncertain about being seen. Oliver noticed, and something in his chest recognized a need. His humming grew softer, more intentional, not a command but an invitation. The sound settled on the stubborn bud like dew, and slowly, petal by petal, the flower opened to receive the night. Nana Rose's hand found his small one. "See?" she murmured, as if describing the weather. Sometimes we only remind a thing how to be itself. That became the shape of their evenings, small invitations, never demands. Oliver learned that his humming wasn't just sound, but a form of tending, like Nana Rose's careful watering and pruning. He was learning a language far older than words, preparing for a path he couldn't yet name, but somehow already knew he was meant to walk. By the time Oliver turned 4, his evening lessons with Nana Rose had woven themselves into the rhythm of his days like a favorite lullaby learned by heart. But mornings brought their own magic, arriving in the form of a small fist tapping against his bedroom window, with the persistence of rain on leaves. Emma lived next door, and she had discovered that the mysterious boy who hummed to flowers was exactly the right age for proper friendship. She would appear at his window as dawn painted the sky in watercolor washes, her red curls escaping their nighttime braids like flames that refused to be contained. Her pajamas still carried the wrinkles of dreams, and her eyes held the bright curiosity of someone who had just remembered something wonderful waiting to be explored. Oliver would unlatch the window, and Emma would climb through with the easy grace of someone who had never met a boundary she couldn't cross with a smile. Emma was everything Oliver wasn't, which perhaps explains why their friendship bloomed with the same natural certainty as Nana Rose's evening primrose. Where Oliver moved through the world with gentle observation, Emma danced through it with delighted discovery. Where he spoke in whispers and hums, she filled rooms with laughter that bubbled up from some inexhaustible well of joy. Where he needed stillness to understand, she needed motion, adventure, the constant unfolding of what might be possible around the next corner or behind the next door. Their first real conversation happened over peanut butter sandwiches that Maya had cut into star shapes, which Emma declared the only acceptable form for serious discussions. They sat cross-legged on Oliver's bedroom floor, surrounded by picture books and the soft morning light that made everything feel possible. Emma wanted to know about the humming, why it made her feel sleepy in the nicest way, why even her golden retriever Buster would curl up and nap whenever Oliver visited their yard. Oliver tried to explain, but at 4 words felt too small for the vastness of what he experienced. Instead, he hummed a gentle melody, watching Emma's face soften as the sound settled around them like invisible blankets. Her endless questions grew quieter, more thoughtful, and when she finally spoke again, it was to ask if he could teach her to make people feel that peaceful. He considered this with the seriousness of someone far older than his years, then shook his head gently. Some things, he explained, couldn't be taught, only shared. This became the foundation of their friendship, Emma's bright energy balanced by Oliver's gentle calm, her scraped knees and grand adventure plans welcomed by his steady presence. She taught him the joy of ordinary childhood wonders, building blanket forts that transformed his living room into kingdoms where they ruled with whispered wisdom, sharing secrets that felt monumentally important in the way only children's secrets can, discovering that friendship meant having someone who never questioned your particular way of being in the world. Emma understood instinctively that Oliver needed quiet spaces, and she learned to create them even in the midst of her own boundless enthusiasm. Their games evolved around his gentle nature, rather than despite it. They played library, with Emma as the eager patron and Oliver as the wise keeper of stories who always knew exactly which book someone needed. Most afternoons found them on the porch swing, legs dangling, sharing star-shaped sandwiches and the comfortable silence that exists between people who understand each other without needing to explain. Through Emma, Oliver discovered that his gift for tending extended beyond flowers to the delicate ecosystem of human friendship, where patience and presence could help another person bloom exactly as they were meant to. When September arrived with its promise of new beginnings, Oliver and Emma walked to school together beneath the maple trees that were just beginning to whisper secrets of autumn. Their friendship had become the steady heartbeat of Oliver's days, but now the rhythm expanded to include 22 other children and a teacher, whose eyes held the particular kindness of someone who understood that learning happened in the spaces between words. Mr. Hartwell kept a collection of smooth river stones on his desk and a spider plant by the window that seemed to thrive on the gentle chaos of third-grade energy. He had the sort of presence that could quiet a room without raising his voice, and when he looked at Oliver during those first weeks of school, it was with the recognition of someone who had been waiting for exactly this child to arrive. His cardigan pockets always held interesting treasures: origami cranes folded from old sheet music, pencils worn smooth by years of patient use, small notebooks filled with observations about how children learned best when they felt truly seen. The classroom hummed with its own complex symphony. Oliver discovered that 23 young hearts created a much more intricate emotional landscape than he had ever navigated. There was Sarah, whose shoulders carried the invisible weight of her parents' recent divorce, tensing whenever voices rose above normal conversation. Marcus struggled with reading, his frustration building like storm clouds before each lesson, while Jenny often dozed during story time, exhausted by nightmares that visited her sleep. Oliver found himself absorbing these undercurrents the way Nana Rose's garden absorbed moonlight, naturally, without effort or intention. Mr. Hartwell noticed how Oliver seemed to listen to more than just the lessons being taught. During math drills, when the room grew restless, Oliver would grow very still, his breathing deep and measured, and somehow the collective anxiety would begin to settle. When Marcus wrestled with difficult words, Oliver's soft humming would begin almost unconsciously, and the struggling reader's shoulders would relax just enough to let the letters arrange themselves into meaning. Rather than seeing this sensitivity as something to manage, Mr. Hartwell recognized it as a gift that needed gentle cultivation. He began creating quiet opportunities for Oliver to share his particular form of caring. The class library became Oliver's domain, where he somehow knew exactly which books belonged together and which stories would comfort rather than overwhelm. When younger children visited from kindergarten for reading partnerships, Oliver would sit with them, his presence helping them settle into the rhythm of shared stories. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. Playground arguments dissolved more quickly. Tears dried with less drama. Even the class hamster, a usually nervous creature named Buster, would venture from his hiding places when Oliver was nearby, drawn by the same inexplicable sense of safety that others felt in the boy's presence. It was during a particularly challenging afternoon, when a new student named Lily joined their class carrying the grey weight of her grandmother's recent death, that Mr. Hartwell first spoke the words that would follow Oliver for years to come. He watched Oliver spend his lunch periods with Lily, not trying to fix her grief, but simply offering his presence like a warm blanket. Day by day, Lily's drawings grew brighter. Her smiles became real rather than polite. After class one evening, as golden light slanted through the windows and the room held the peaceful exhaustion of a day well spent, Mr. Hartwell knelt beside Oliver's desk. "You know what you are?" he said, his voice carrying the weight of recognition. "You're a tender of dreams. You help people remember how to rest easy, how to feel safe enough to hope again." The words settled around Oliver like truth finding its proper home, and somewhere deep in his chest, something that had been waiting began to unfurl, preparing for a journey he couldn't yet imagine, but somehow already knew he was meant to take. The words "tender of dreams" followed Oliver home that evening, like seeds carried on gentle wind, settling into the quiet spaces of his understanding, where important truths take root slowly and with care. Emma skipped ahead on their familiar path, balancing on the shadow of the fence post as if it were a tightrope only she could see, chattering about plans for his upcoming 9th birthday, with the boundless enthusiasm that made ordinary days feel touched by magic. The phrase rolled through Oliver's mind with each step, not demanding attention, but offering itself like a gift he wasn't quite ready to unwrap. That evening, as twilight painted the sky in watercolor washes of purple and gold, Oliver found himself drawn once again to Nana Rose's garden. She was waiting among her night-blooming flowers, her silver hair catching the last light as she tended to a particularly stubborn evening primrose that had been slow to establish itself. When he shared Mr. Hartwell's words, she nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose patient waiting had finally borne fruit, her weathered hands continuing their gentle work in the soil. "Some truth," she said, her voice soft as the rustle of leaves, "take their own time to reveal themselves. But when they do, they change everything." She showed him how the evening primrose had finally begun to send out new shoots, tiny green promises that had been growing in darkness until they were strong enough to reach toward light. On the night of his 9th birthday, a late summer storm rolled across the town, not with the gentle rain of his birth, but with the dramatic flourish of wind and distant thunder. Oliver lay in bed listening to rain tap a restless rhythm against his window pane, a cadence unlike the soothing percussion he remembered from his earliest days. The air felt charged with expectation, and sleep seemed like a distant shore he couldn't quite reach, despite his usual soft humming. Then, without warning, the world shifted. It wasn't the abrupt jolt of waking, nor the familiar slide into ordinary dreams, but something altogether different, like stepping through a hidden doorway that had always been there, waiting for him to notice. He found himself standing in a vast moonlit meadow that stretched beyond the horizon, where grass grew in patterns that seemed to pulse with gentle rhythm, as if the earth itself were breathing. This was no ordinary field. Some patches were tangled and overgrown with thorny anxiety, their shadows deep and restless, with what Oliver recognized as the worries of people he knew and many he didn't. Other areas lay sparse and brown, carrying the particular sadness of hopes that had withered, while still others bloomed with wild joy, their blades reaching skyward like tiny hands, celebrating invisible victories. The meadow felt familiar in the way important places do, as if he had been walking these paths in dreams he couldn't quite remember upon waking. As Oliver moved through this living landscape of emotions, his humming began naturally, deeper and more resonant than ever before. Where his voice touched the grass, something extraordinary happened. The tangled patches began to loosen their anxious knots, releasing into more natural breathing patterns. The sparse areas filled gradually with tender green shoots that seemed to remember their own possibility. The joyful sections simply danced, their celebration growing more harmonious, less frantic. He understood without being told that this meadow existed somewhere between sleeping and waking, a place where the inner worlds of everyone he cared about grew like living things. When he finally opened his eyes in his own bed, the scent of night air lingered in his nostrils, and Oliver knew with absolute certainty that he had discovered the deeper meaning of being a tender of dreams. The morning after his journey to the Dream Meadow, Oliver woke with dewdrops still clinging to his pajama sleeves and the impossible scent of night-blooming jasmine lingering in his hair. He dressed slowly, running his fingers over these small impossibilities, evidence of a place that felt more real than his own bedroom. At breakfast, Maya noticed his unusual stillness, the way he seemed to be listening to something just beyond their kitchen walls. But she simply added extra honey to his toast and waited with the patient wisdom of mothers who understand that some discoveries need time to unfold. When Emma appeared at his window that afternoon, her usual cascade of morning adventures quieted as she studied his face with the intuitive recognition that flows between true friends. "Something's different," she said softly, settling beside him on his bedroom floor with the gravity of someone who sensed they were about to learn something important. Oliver nodded, and together they made their way to their favorite spot beneath the old oak tree, where the most meaningful conversations had always found their natural home. He tried to explain the meadow, the grass that grew in patterns of human emotion, the way his humming had helped anxious tangles release into more peaceful arrangements. Emma listened with the particular stillness she reserved for Oliver's deepest truths, her bright energy focused like sunlight through a magnifying glass. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, her fingers absently braiding blades of grass as she processed what she had heard. "My dreams have been different lately," she finally admitted, her voice carrying a wonder that matched his own. Calmer somehow, like someone was helping me sort through all the scattered pieces of my day before I went to sleep. The nightmares about my parents fighting just faded away. She looked up at him with eyes that held new understanding. "That was you, wasn't it? In the meadow, tending to my dreams." Oliver felt something warm expand in his chest, a mixture of joy and responsibility that was both thrilling and slightly overwhelming. He had helped Emma without even knowing it, had somehow reached across the space between their sleeping minds and offered comfort when she needed it most. The magnitude of this gift began to settle around him like a cloak that was both beautiful and heavy with meaning. That evening, he walked to Nana Rose's garden, with steps that carried the weight of questions too large for a 9-year-old boy to hold alone. She was waiting among her evening primrose, but tonight her attention was focused entirely on him, as if she had been preparing for this conversation since the moment he first hummed in her arms as a toddler. The air was thick with the fragrance of night-blooming flowers and the electric anticipation that comes before important truths are shared. When Oliver described his journey to the dream meadow and Emma's confirmation of its effects, Nana Rose's weathered face shifted through recognition, pride, and something that looked like gentle melancholy. She led him to their familiar bench beneath the apple tree, and in the gathering twilight, she began to share secrets she had carried in her heart for decades, like pressed flowers in an old book. "I was once a dream tender too," she said, her voice soft as the rustle of leaves settling into evening quiet. "My meadow was different from yours. It appeared as a vast garden where people's worries grew like weeds and their hopes bloomed like flowers. I could help pull the choking vines of anxiety, water the tender shoots of new possibilities." Her eyes grew distant, looking towards something only she could see. But the gift fades with age, like eyesight dimming or hearing growing soft. "Now I can only remember what it felt like to walk in that sacred space." She explained that dream tending was both blessing and responsibility, appearing perhaps once in a generation, but always serving the same essential purpose. Some tenders worked with sound, as Oliver did. Others used touch, movement, or simply the quality of their presence. All shared the ability to enter the liminal space where dreams took root and grew into the experiences that shaped waking life. "The first rule," she said, taking his hands in hers with the solemnity of someone passing down ancient wisdom, "is never to force, only to invite. Dreams are living things, Oliver, as alive as these flowers around us. Like all living things, they must choose their own path toward growth. We can offer encouragement, create conditions for healing, but we cannot impose our will without causing harm to both the dreamer and ourselves." She began teaching him how to prepare for sleep with intention, not just the ordinary rituals of brushing teeth and changing into pajamas, but the deeper preparation of releasing the day's tangles and approaching rest as a sacred act. She showed him how to recognize the subtle difference between his own dreams, warm and familiar as his own heartbeat, and the shared landscape where others' rest unfolded, which felt vast and cool as wind moving through an open field. Most importantly, she taught him how to tend without taking over, how to stand at the edge of someone else's emotional landscape and offer his gift, while respecting the sovereignty of their inner world. "Her dream tender," she said as the first evening stars appeared overhead, "is like a gardener who helps things grow the way they want to grow, not the way we think they should. We offer water and gentle attention, but we never force the blooming." As the night deepened around them and the garden filled with its familiar symphony of settling leaves and distant owls, Oliver felt the true weight of his calling settle around his shoulders. It was beautiful and terrifying and utterly right, like finding a path he had been meant to walk since before he was born, leading toward a future he couldn't yet imagine, but somehow already knew he was ready to embrace. The weeks that followed Nana Rose's revelation transformed Oliver's understanding like morning light, gradually illuminating a familiar room, revealing details that had always been there but never truly seen. As autumn painted the maple leaves in watercolor washes of gold and crimson, he carried her gentle wisdom into the bustling hallways of middle school, where the emotional symphony had grown far more complex than anything he had encountered in Mr. Hartwell's peaceful classroom. Here, beneath fluorescent lights that hummed their own thin songs, Oliver discovered that feelings had colors in his mind's eye. Anxiety appeared as tangled gray threads that seemed to catch on everything they touched. Excitement sparkled like golden ribbons dancing in invisible wind. Sadness flowed in deep blue currents that moved slowly, but with surprising depth, while contentment settled like warm amber light, rare and precious when it appeared. The hallways became a living tapestry, where hundreds of these emotional threads wove together in patterns that shifted with each passing moment. With Nana Rose's teaching echoing in his memory like a favorite lullaby, Oliver began to imagine his humming as a gentle loom that could help weave these scattered threads into more harmonious patterns. But first, she had taught him, he must learn to tend his own inner landscape. In the quiet of his bedroom each evening, he would identify the anxious threads knotting in his chest before a difficult test, or the prickly threads of frustration when homework problems seemed to twist away from understanding. Then, with soft, deliberate breaths and the merest whisper of a hum, he would invite those threads to loosen, to find their natural place within the larger tapestry of his being. Only after weeks of this gentle self-tending did Oliver begin extending his gift to others. When Marcus struggled with reading and frustration built around his desk like storm clouds, Oliver would sit nearby and hum so softly that even he barely heard it, watching as the angry red threads gradually loosened into something more manageable. The humming wasn't a command or demand, but an invitation, the same way evening primrose invited moonlight to help it bloom. Emma noticed the change in him with the intuitive precision that flows between true friends. During their afternoon conversations beneath the oak tree, she observed how other children seemed drawn to their quiet space, arriving with scraped knees or hurt feelings and leaving with lighter steps. "It's like you're becoming a lighthouse," she said one day. Her head tilted in the thoughtful way that meant she was reaching for words to describe something beyond ordinary understanding. Not the kind that warns ships away from danger, but the kind that helps them find safe harbor. The metaphor settled into Oliver's understanding with the satisfying click of a puzzle piece finding its proper place. His reputation began to solidify, not as a leader or standout student, but as the person you could sit with when you needed to think, when the world felt too loud, when you simply needed space to breathe. During group projects when tensions mounted, classmates would find themselves unconsciously gravitating toward wherever Oliver was quietly organizing materials, his movements slow and deliberate, his silent presence a steady anchor in rising tides of frustration. This quiet superpower, born from the gentle hum of his earliest days and nurtured by Nana Rose's patient wisdom, was preparing him for connections and challenges that stretched far beyond school walls, toward a future where his gift would touch lives in ways he couldn't yet imagine but somehow already knew he was meant to discover. The first true test of Oliver's growing understanding arrived during the grey weeks of February in 7th grade, when Emma's bright energy began to dim like a lamp with a failing bulb. The change came slowly at first, the way important shifts always do. A hesitation before her usual morning plans, a quietness that settled around her like dust on forgotten furniture. Her parents, who had always moved through their house with easy rhythm, began speaking in careful, measured tones that carried the weight of words chosen too deliberately. Oliver noticed the shift in Emma's emotional threads before she spoke about it. Where golden ribbons of joy had once danced around her presence, now grey strands of confusion tangled with deep blue currents of sadness that seemed to have no bottom. Her laughter, when it came, felt hollow as an echo in an empty room. She stopped appearing at his window in the mornings, stopped making plans for weekend adventures, stopped finishing the star-shaped sandwiches Maya still prepared, hopefully for their afternoon conversations. When Emma finally told him about the divorce papers, her words came out flat and careful, as if she were reading from a script she had memorized but didn't understand. They sat beneath their oak tree on a day when winter held the world in shades of grey, and Oliver felt her pain settle around them like cold fog that seemed to muffle even the distant sounds of traffic and wind. His first instinct was to hum, to offer the gentle invitation that had helped so many classmates find their way through difficult moments. But when he began that familiar, soft melody, Emma's shoulders tensed rather than relaxed. The sound that had always been comfort now felt intrusive, like trying to put a bandage on a wound that needed to bleed clean before it could heal. Oliver stopped immediately, remembering Nana Rose's first rule echoing in his memory: never force, only invite. For weeks, he learned a different kind of dream tending, the art of presence without purpose, of offering companionship that asked for nothing in return. He appeared at Emma's house with homework assignments when she missed school, sitting in her room while she stared at the ceiling and spoke in fragments about how different everything felt. He shared comfortable silences that stretched like gentle bridges across the chasm of her grief, never pushing for conversation, but always ready to listen when words finally came. During this time, Oliver discovered that his gift extended far beyond the soft humming that had defined it since childhood. His presence itself had become a form of tending, the way he moved through space with deliberate calm, the quality of attention he offered that made people feel truly seen, the particular stillness he carried that seemed to slow time just enough for healing to find its own pace. That night in the dream meadow, he found Emma's section in upheaval, not tangled anxiety, but something like a landscape after an earthquake where familiar paths had been disrupted. He sat at the edge of this disrupted space, not humming but simply being present. Gradually, Emma's dream self appeared, trying to build something that wouldn't hold together. Oliver didn't try to help with construction or suggest different approaches. He simply sat nearby, his presence a steady point of reference, and slowly Emma stopped trying to rebuild what had been lost and began creating something entirely new. One rainy afternoon in early spring, Emma appeared at his window again, not with her usual bright tap, but with a soft, hesitant knock. She climbed through and sat quietly, and after a long moment Oliver began to hum so softly it felt like shared understanding. For the first time in weeks, Emma leaned against him, and her breathing grew soft and even, as if something tight in her heart had finally begun to loosen. Oliver learned that healing was not an event, but a process, and that sometimes the most profound tending happened through the simple gift of witnessed presence, knowing that someone cared enough to sit with you in the dark, until dawn found its own way home. As spring returned, with its gentle insistence that all things could begin again, Emma's healing became a quiet testament to the patient nature of true mending. Her laughter returned in brighter bursts, her eyes holding less shadow and more of their familiar light. Their friendship, forged in the quiet fire of shared vulnerability, now carried a deeper resonance that transcended words. But even as Oliver celebrated his friend's slow return to brightness, another kind of teaching was waiting in the gentle corners of his understanding. Nana Rose, who had always seemed as eternal as the moonflowers in her garden, began to move with a new, fragile slowness. Her silver hair seemed to catch light differently now, and the scent of lavender and rosemary that clung to her hands grew fainter, as if she were gradually becoming something more ethereal, less anchored to the earth she had tended so lovingly. Her evenings in the garden, once filled with active tending, became quiet vigils on their familiar bench, her gaze fixed on the night-blooming flowers with a reverence that felt like a long goodbye. Oliver felt the change in her, with a quiet ache in his chest, recognizing it first in the dream meadow where her section had begun to transform. The anxious tangles and sparse patches of worry had given way to something entirely different, what she called memory flowers, moments from her long life that bloomed with startling vividness in organized rows like a beloved, well-worn photo album. These dreams were lucid and gentle, not concerned with daily anxieties, but imbued with the deep, reflective peace of a life fully lived. One evening in late April, when the air carried the green promise of summer and her garden hummed with returning life, Nana Rose took Oliver's hand with unusual intensity. Her fingers, still fragrant with soil and growing things, felt lighter than he remembered, as if she were preparing for a different kind of journey. "There's something I need to teach you," she said, her voice carrying the particular weight that always preceded important lessons. The hardest part of being a dream tender, but perhaps the most sacred: how to help someone prepare for the ultimate sleep. Over the following weeks, Oliver learned to walk among Nana Rose's memory flowers with reverence, understanding that his role was not to organize or improve, but simply to witness and honor. She shared stories of growing up near the sea, of salt air and her own grandmother, who had taught her the names of stars. Oliver's humming became a soft counterpoint to her words, helping to smooth the edges of forgotten details, bringing gentle clarity to fading images. She taught him that death was not the opposite of dream tending, but its most sacred expression, the final invitation to rest, the ultimate flowering of a soul ready to release its earthly attachments. His humming in her presence became softer, more spacious, less about healing and more about honoring the natural cycle of all living things. During her final weeks, when breathing became conscious effort and her garden visits grew shorter, Nana Rose's dreams became luminous with peace. Oliver sat with her each evening, his presence a gentle bridge between the world she was leaving and whatever waited beyond. When she passed on a quiet morning in June, surrounded by the fragrance of her beloved night-blooming flowers, the room filled not with grief but with profound, quiet peace. Oliver understood then, with clarity that settled deep into his bones, that he had received the deepest teaching of all, that love continues beyond the boundaries of individual life, that tending can take the form of helping someone complete their earthly journey with dignity, and that his gift was not just about soothing anxieties, but about honoring the full cycle of human experience. The moonflowers in her garden bloomed with extraordinary luminescence that night, as if in silent tribute to the woman who had taught them all how to embrace the dark. The summer after Nana Rose's passing moved with the slow, reverent pace of healing, each day unfolding like a gentle prayer offered to memory and growing understanding. Oliver spent long hours in her garden, which Maya and Thomas had quietly agreed to tend, learning the weight of soil ready for water and the particular way moonflowers opened when no one was watching except the stars. Her absence ached like a missing note in a familiar song, but her teachings had rooted themselves so deeply in his understanding that he could feel her presence in every careful gesture, every patient moment of tending. When September arrived with its familiar promise of new beginnings, Oliver entered Jefferson High, carrying wisdom that seemed too vast for his 15-year-old frame. The building hummed with different energy than middle school, more intense, more complex, filled with the particular anxieties of young people standing at the threshold between childhood and whatever came next. The emotional threads he perceived were no longer just individual worries, but vast shifting currents of aspiration, insecurity, rebellion, and dreams that hadn't yet learned their own names. His reputation preceded him in the way meaningful things do, passed along through whispered conversations between siblings, through the grateful mentions of former classmates who remembered the boy who could help you breathe easier, just by sitting nearby. Oliver moved through the crowded hallways with quiet steadiness, his presence a subtle anchor in the often turbulent sea of adolescent emotions. He wasn't popular in the conventional sense, but he had become something far more enduring, universally trusted. Within weeks, a subtle pilgrimage began to form around the old oak tree behind the school, where Oliver could be found most lunch periods, with extra star-shaped sandwiches that Maya still prepared with hopeful understanding. His humming had evolved into something even more subtle, not a sound others could clearly identify, but a quality of presence that seemed to create space for whatever needed to emerge. There was Jessica, whose perfectionism had twisted into paralyzing anxiety that kept her awake rehearsing tomorrow's failures. Marcus had followed him to high school, still struggling with reading but now carrying additional weight from his father's job loss. New faces appeared regularly. David, whose parents' expectations felt like stones in his backpack. Sarah, whose eating disorder whispered cruel lies that grew louder in the cafeteria's chaos. Priya, whose brilliant mind raced at bedtime, unable to find the off switch for her spinning thoughts. Oliver rarely offered advice in the conventional sense. Instead, he created conditions where his classmates could hear their own wisdom more clearly, his gentle questions soft and spacious. What would it feel like if that worry was just a little bit smaller? He helped them recognize that emotions, like Nana Rose's flowers, had their own seasons and cycles, and that even difficult feelings could be tended with patience rather than fought with force. It was Ms. Chen, the new music therapy teacher, who recognized something deeper in Oliver's gift. She had been watching from her classroom window, drawn by the quality of peace that seemed to emanate from their informal gatherings beneath the oak tree. One afternoon, as students dispersed like dandelion seeds carried on gentle wind, she approached with questions that carried the weight of professional curiosity mixed with genuine wonder. "I've been observing what happens here," she said, her voice holding the particular respect reserved for sacred things. "There's something about the way you help people find their center. Have you ever considered that this gift might extend beyond these lunch periods?" Her words settled around Oliver like seeds finding fertile ground, carrying possibilities he hadn't yet imagined, but somehow already knew he was meant to explore. Ms. Chen's question settled into Oliver's understanding like seeds finding fertile ground, carrying possibilities he hadn't yet imagined, but somehow already knew he was meant to explore. That afternoon, she invited him to the music therapy room after the hallways emptied, and the building released its daily breath of accumulated worries. There, among instruments that seemed to hold their own quiet wisdom, she played recordings of sustained tones and gentle rhythms designed to steady anxious minds. Oliver listened with the focused attention Nana Rose had taught him, sensing how certain frequencies seemed to comb through tangled thoughts and lay them smooth. When he hummed softly along, the room's small sounds, the heating vent's whisper, the distant tick of clocks, the soft settling of the building itself, fell into unhurried harmony. His voice found its place in this therapeutic symphony as naturally as moonflowers opening to receive starlight. "Sound can be a bridge to calm," Ms. Chen observed, watching how his presence seemed to tune the very air around them. She spoke of research she had been following, studies that suggested what Oliver had always known intuitively, that certain vibrations could help nervous systems find their way from chaos to peace. But more than the science, it was her recognition of his gift as something that could grow beyond these familiar walls, that stirred new possibilities in his chest. She mentioned Dr. Sarah Chen at the State University, no relation, but a kindred spirit who studied the intersection of music and neurological calm. Her research explores how sound influences sleep patterns, how rhythm can guide minds toward rest, Ms. Chen explained, her words carrying the weight of doors about to open. "If you're interested in understanding the deeper mechanics of what you do naturally, she might be exactly the mentor you need." Over the following months, Oliver found himself drawn to weekend lectures at the university, sitting in the back of halls that smelled of chalk and possibility. Dr. Sarah Chen spoke with the grounded wonder of someone who trusted both data and mystery, showing slides of brainwaves changing shape under lullabies, of heart rates settling when breath matched steady rhythms. Her work gave scientific language to phenomena Oliver had felt since childhood: parasympathetic response, entrainment, the way gentle persistence could invite rather than force. But Dr. Chen's most important teaching echoed Nana Rose's earliest lessons about responsibility. During their first real conversation, after a lecture on therapeutic sound, she looked at Oliver with the particular attention reserved for recognizing rare gifts. "Abilities like yours," she said quietly, "carry the weight of genuine healing. They must be shared thoughtfully, with full awareness of the trust people place in your presence." The path toward college began to clarify like dawn, gradually illuminating familiar landscape. Oliver understood that his calling was expanding beyond the oak tree's shade toward possibilities that honored both the mystical origins of his gift and the scientific principles that could help him serve others more effectively. Emma, ever his anchor to ordinary joys, made him promise to keep space for star-shaped sandwiches and afternoon naps, reminding him that the most profound gifts often grew from the simplest human connections. The university campus in autumn carried its own symphony of possibility, where Oliver's footsteps on brick pathways seemed to join a conversation that had been ongoing for generations. He chose to study psychology and music therapy, drawn to the intersection where science met the ineffable mysteries he had always known. Dr. Sarah, Chen became more than a professor. She became the bridge between his intuitive understanding and the structured knowledge that would help him serve others with greater precision and care. In her research lab, surrounded by equipment that measured what couldn't be seen, Oliver learned to read the language of brainwaves and heart rhythms. He watched monitors display the gentle chaos of anxious minds, then observed how his humming created visible patterns of settling, like watching storms transform into steady rain on electronic screens. The science fascinated him not because it explained away the mystery of his gift, but because it revealed the elegant mechanics through which wonder operated in the physical world. Dr. Chen's mentorship carried the same patient wisdom Nana Rose had offered, but focused through the lens of ethical practice and professional responsibility. "People will trust you with their most vulnerable moments," she explained during late afternoon sessions, when golden light slanted through lab windows. "That trust is sacred, and it requires not just natural ability, but trained understanding of human psychology, proper boundaries, and the humility to know when to refer someone to other forms of help." It was during a late-night study session in the library's quietest corner that Oliver encountered the person who would reshape his understanding of love itself. Luna sat beneath a lamp that framed her in warm light. Surrounded by books on sleep medicine and neurology, her focus a kind of stillness that Oliver recognized instantly. Not absence, but presence, the kind of attention Nana Rose had taught him to offer the world. When they both reached for the same reference journal, their hands paused, and they smiled with the soft amusement of strangers who already trusted the moment. Luna wrote a quick note on a sticky pad. "You can have it, I only need the first article," and slid it toward him. He wrote back, "Thank you, I think I'll start from the second," and their conversation began to unfold in small gestures. Shared pages, coffee passed back and forth, the quiet choreography of two people moving in synchronized care without planning it. Luna had grown up in a deaf household where communication flowed through visual and tactile channels, where silence was not emptiness but language. "Attention is a kind of love," she said, her hands translating her thoughts with soft fluency, and Oliver felt something rearrange in him, like a tapestry finding its tighter weave. She understood quiet not as absence, but as presence, as the spacious awareness that allowed all forms of communication to find their proper home. Their study sessions became gentle orbits around shared understanding. Luna's medical training gave her precise knowledge of sleep physiology. She could explain the neurological mechanisms of insomnia with scientific clarity, while Oliver's gift offered insight into the emotional landscapes that often prevented rest. She taught him to watch breath the way he watched moonflowers, how inhale and exhale told stories long before someone found language for them. He showed her how sustained tones could coax nervous systems toward peace, and together they discovered that healing often required both scientific understanding and the ancient art of creating safe spaces for vulnerability. In Luna's presence, Oliver felt his calling expand beyond individual practice toward something collaborative and comprehensive. Two different ways of listening, learning how to move as one, guiding them toward work that neither could accomplish alone. Their love developed slowly, built on shared understanding of how much could be communicated without words, how healing could happen in the spaces between sounds. During their final year of studies, Luna's medical training and Oliver's intuitive gift began weaving together like complementary melodies finding harmony. Their senior thesis project became a love letter to the intersection of science and mystery, documenting how traditional therapeutic approaches could be enhanced by what they termed presence-based sleep support. Dr. Chen served as their advisor, helping them navigate the delicate balance between honoring Oliver's unique abilities and presenting their work within frameworks the medical community could understand and accept. The results were remarkable in their quiet consistency, Participants who had struggled with racing thoughts for months would find their minds settling into natural rhythms under Oliver's gentle presence. Luna's equipment registered the measurable changes: decreased cortisol levels, synchronized brainwaves, the gradual shift from sympathetic to parasympathetic nervous system dominance, while Oliver felt the subtler transformation in the dream meadow, watching anxious tangles release into breathing patterns of peace. The Victorian house found them, rather than the other way around, appearing on a quiet street, lined with oak trees that reminded Oliver of his childhood afternoons with Emma. The previous owner had been an elderly botanist who had filled the backyard with night-blooming flowers, evening primrose, 4 o'clocks, moonflowers that climbed wooden trellises toward the stars. When Oliver and Luna walked through the garden on their first visit, the scent of approaching dusk and patient blooms felt like Nana Rose offering her blessing from whatever realm she now tended. They converted the house slowly, with reverence for its bones and history. Luna's consultation room occupied the front parlor, where she could conduct initial medical assessments with gentle precision, ruling out physical causes and ensuring clients received appropriate care for any underlying conditions. The back sunroom transformed into Oliver's practice space, furnished with comfortable chairs and surrounded by windows that caught moonlight and held it gently. Dr. Chen visited with practical guidance, helping them shape consent processes and referral pathways, reminding them that integrity was the most tender form of care. Their practice opened quietly, without fanfare, the way important things often begin. Word spread through the gentle networks of people who had been helped, former classmates who remembered Oliver's oak tree gatherings, medical professionals who had heard Luna speak about sleep disorders, therapists seeking complementary approaches for clients whose insomnia resisted conventional treatment. People arrived carrying bags of worry that had no zippers. There was the music teacher, whose hands trembled around her teacup, unable to sleep through the night for months. A widower wore his wedding ring like a soft weight he didn't know where to place. A college student whose mind spun bright wheels at midnight, wishing desperately for an off switch. Luna listened first, translating symptoms into gentle maps, breath patterns, cortisol curves, the practical ways a body remembered fear, keeping her voice as steady as a hand on a small boat in mild tide. Then Oliver entered as one might enter a quiet chapel, not to speak, but to make room. He sat with clients as they prepared for sleep, his presence creating the same spacious calm he had offered beneath the high school oak tree, but now informed by years of study and Luna's medical knowledge. His method remained beautifully simple, watching the rise and fall of breath the way he used to watch moonflowers decide it was time. The humming came when invited, a tone that was less performance than gentle invitation to the nervous system, helping it remember its capacity for peace. The garden became Oliver's outdoor sanctuary, where he spent hours transforming the botanist's legacy into a living testament to Nana Rose's teachings. Night-blooming jasmine climbed the existing trellises, evening primrose opened yellow eyes to twilight, and moonflowers unfurled their white trumpets, releasing sweet perfume into the night air. Clients waiting for sessions or emerging from deep, restorative rest would often wander among the quiet blossoms, finding unexpected calm in the patient rhythm of flowers that understood darkness as invitation rather than ending. Their clinic became known as a place where people could find rest for both body and spirit, where the ancient art of tending to each other's dreams met modern understanding of sleep medicine, creating something entirely new yet rooted in wisdom as old as lullabies themselves. Among the many people who found their way to the clinic's gentle embrace, 7-year-old Zoe arrived like a small storm wrapped in bright colors and exhaustion. Her parents, Maria and David, carried the particular weariness of people who had been living on borrowed sleep for months, their voices soft with the careful hope of those who had tried everything conventional medicine could offer. Zoe didn't hide behind her parents' legs or stare at her shoes the way many children did in new places. Instead, she studied the sunroom with the focused intensity of someone cataloging wonders, her eyes holding depths that seemed far older than 7 years. Luna's assessment revealed what Oliver had begun to suspect. This wasn't a child with a sleep disorder, but someone whose nervous system processed the world with extraordinary sensitivity. Zoe's dreams, her mother explained with gentle exhaustion, were like swimming through paintings that never end, cascading waterfalls of color and emotion that left her gasping awake multiple times each night. Her dream journal, filled with crayon drawings that looked like fireworks painted by someone who had never learned that colors were supposed to stay inside lines, told the story of a mind too brilliant to find its own off switch. When Oliver first entered the dream meadow during one of Zoe's sessions, he found her section as a constant aurora borealis, magnificent and overwhelming, where emotions bloomed in such vivid intensity that peaceful sleep seemed impossible beneath such spectacular inner weather. But rather than chaos, Oliver recognized something achingly familiar, another dream tender, but one whose gift manifested as immersive experience rather than gentle guidance. His approach with Zoe became collaboration rather than treatment. During their first real conversation, he offered her a box of crayons and asked, "Which color feels the loudest in your dreams?" Without hesitation, she chose electric blue, fierce yellow, and magenta that seemed to vibrate with its own energy. "Do you have a color that whispers?" he asked gently. After long consideration, she selected a gray-green that nobody would choose for celebrations. "This one smells like rain," she said with quiet certainty. Together, they began what Oliver called dream architecture, not dimming Zoe's vivid experiences, but helping her create small, quiet spaces within the color storms where she could rest. They drew pictures of vast, swirling emotions, with tiny, peaceful clearings at their edges, like islands in brilliant oceans. Oliver taught her to imagine these safe harbors during overwhelming moments, places where all colors could exist, but some chose to sleep. The breakthrough came during an evening session when moonflowers were opening in the garden beyond the windows. Zoe watched one unfurl its white petals and whispered, "It's not white, it's every color sleeping." Oliver felt something click into place like a key finding its lock. That became her anchor. When dream colors threatened to overwhelm, she could find that moonflower in her mind, every color, sleeping, and rest beside it until morning. Working with Zoe reminded Oliver that his gift sometimes meant recognizing and nurturing fellow tenders rather than simply offering comfort. He wasn't teaching her to dim her extraordinary sensitivity, but to build gentle structures where her brilliance could exist without exhaustion. Within weeks, her parents reported longer stretches of peaceful sleep, and Zoe began describing her dreams not as overwhelming storms, but as adventures she was learning to navigate with growing confidence. By month's end, when Zoe brought Oliver a drawing of a moonflower surrounded by organized swirls of color, he understood that some of his most important work would be helping other sensitive souls discover their own capacity for tending, creating, ripples of peace that would extend far beyond anything he could accomplish alone. The success with Zoe had left something luminous in the clinic's atmosphere, a reminder that Oliver's gift sometimes meant recognizing and nurturing fellow tenders rather than simply offering comfort. As he tended the evening primrose in Nana, Rose's garden, watching their yellow faces turn toward the approaching dusk, the familiar creak of the garden gate announced an arrival that made his heart pause mid-beat. Emma stood at the edge of the jasmine trellis, her red curls now tamed into the sophisticated arrangement of someone who designed buildings that touched clouds, but her eyes carrying shadows Oliver recognized with the immediate understanding. That flows between souls who have known each other since star-shaped sandwiches seemed like the most important currency in the world. "I heard there was a place where people learn to sleep again," she said, her voice holding the particular mixture of hope and hesitation that belonged to someone who had tried everything conventional wisdom could offer. The years had refined her brightness rather than dimmed it. She moved with the confident grace of someone whose creativity had found expression in steel and glass, but Oliver could see the exhaustion that lived beneath her professional composure, the way her shoulders carried invisible blueprints of worry that never found their way to peaceful completion. They sat in the sunroom as twilight painted the windows in watercolor washes, and Emma spoke with the careful honesty of someone who had rehearsed explanations but chose vulnerability instead. The divorce had been finalized months ago, she explained, a careful dissolution of something that had looked beautiful from the outside, but had forgotten to include windows for breathing. Her architectural firm thrived, her projects grew more ambitious, but sleep had become a foreign country whose borders she couldn't seem to cross, no matter how many meditation apps or sleep hygiene protocols she tried. Luna joined them briefly, with tea and her particular warmth, conducting a gentle assessment that revealed what Oliver had already sensed. This wasn't a medical sleep disorder, but the familiar territory of a mind that had learned to race when darkness fell. Emma accepted Luna's questions with the gratitude of someone who had grown tired of explaining herself, her hands wrapped around the warm cup, as if borrowing heat could help her remember what rest felt like. When Oliver finally began their first session, the humming didn't come immediately. Instead, they watched two moonflowers unfurl their white trumpets in the garden beyond the windows, letting that simple miracle create the spacious quiet where healing could begin. Emma's breathing gradually matched the flowers' patient rhythm, and when Oliver's gentle tone finally rose, it was barely audible, not a performance but an invitation, the same soft presence he had offered beneath their childhood oak tree, now refined by years of understanding how sound could create bridges between anxiety and peace. That night in the dream meadow, Oliver found Emma's section transformed into something like an architectural studio after a creative storm. Brilliant blueprints scattered by winds of uncertainty, half-built structures of hope abandoned mid-construction. The innovative energy that had always defined her now tangled with the particular grief that comes from watching carefully planned futures crumble. He didn't attempt to organize or rebuild. Instead, he sat quietly among the beautiful ruins, his presence offering the same patient witness he had learned to provide during her parents' divorce decades before, watching as a single evening primrose began to bloom in the center of the scattered dreams, yellow and steady as childhood friendship, reminding them both that some foundations, once established, could weather any storm and still provide ground for new growth. Emma's healing became a testament to the enduring power of friendship and the way love could wait patiently through seasons of separation, then return exactly when it was needed most, transformed by time into something deeper than comfort, the yi. Profound recognition that we are never truly alone in our struggles to find peace. As Emma's healing progressed through gentle weeks of rediscovered rest, Oliver began to notice something extraordinary happening in the dream meadow, connections forming like underground root systems between the sections where different souls had found their peace. The evening primrose that had bloomed in Emma's scattered blueprints began to send delicate tendrils toward other areas, linking her growing calm with the moonflower sanctuary he had helped Zoe create, weaving threads of shared serenity that seemed to strengthen both spaces without diminishing either. This phenomenon puzzled him until correspondence began arriving from unexpected corners of the world, as if Emma's healing had sent ripples through invisible networks he had never imagined. The first letter came from Dr. Kenji Tanaka in Japan, forwarded through Dr. Chen's research connections, describing similar work in mountain villages, where traditional lullabies created crystalline landscapes of collective rest. His careful handwriting carried the fragrance of possibility, speaking of sleep networks that transcended individual healing to create shared spaces of profound peace. More letters followed like gentle rain. Maria Santos wrote from Brazil about sound bowls that created architectural spaces in the mind, her words accompanied by pressed flowers that somehow retained their original colors despite the long journey. From Ghana, Amara Okafor shared stories of ancestral lullabies that bloomed like acacia trees in shared sleep, her letter arriving on paper that smelled faintly of wood smoke and patience. Each described the same phenomenon Oliver was witnessing: individual healing that somehow strengthened a larger web of collective rest. Their communications developed into something deeper than professional correspondence. Through dreams as much as through conventional channels, Oliver found himself walking through other tenders' landscapes, sharing techniques with the reverence of gardeners exchanging rare seeds. Kenji's mountain meadows felt different from Oliver's grassland, cooler, more vertical, filled with the particular peace of high places. But the underlying principles remained constant: patience, invitation rather than force, and deep respect for the sovereignty of each dreamer's inner world. Luna noticed the change in Oliver's practice before he fully understood it himself. His sessions began carrying echoes of wisdom from other traditions, the rhythmic breathing techniques Kenji had shared, Maria's understanding of how different frequencies could create safe harbors in turbulent minds, Amara's insights about how healing could honor both individual needs and collective belonging. The phrase "never force, only invite" became their shared North Star, repeated like prayer across continents and time zones. The clinic's garden began to reflect these influences as Oliver planted herbs and flowers that connected him to his distant colleagues, lavender from the Mediterranean traditions that Amara had described, jasmine that reminded him of Kenji's mountain gardens, and small succulents that Maria had mentioned as dreams that needed very little water, but infinite patience. Visitors began arriving. Not many, but enough to transform the space into something like a quiet embassy, where different traditions of sleep healing could meet and recognize each other. Professor Anya Sharma arrived during the first autumn of this expanding network, her presence carrying the weight of decades spent studying what she called the subtle energies that weave through human consciousness. She sat among the moonflowers as twilight painted the sky in watercolor washes, sharing stories of dream weavers from indigenous cultures, sleep whisperers from forgotten monasteries, all working with different methods but toward the same gentle purpose, restoring harmony to the inner world. As the network grew organically, each new connection strengthening the whole, Oliver realized that his gift had evolved far beyond the gentle humming that had defined his childhood. He had become part of something vast and ancient, a living constellation of people who understood that peace was not a private possession, but a shared resource, tended collectively and offered freely to a world that had forgotten how to sleep without fear. The quiet revolution he represented was not about replacing medical treatment, but about remembering the healing power of human connection and the ancient wisdom of tending to each other's rest, one dream at a time, across borders and generations, like seeds carried on gentle wind to wherever they were needed most. The network of dream tenders had been growing for 3 years, like a garden tended by invisible hands, each new connection strengthening the whole, when Oliver faced the greatest challenge of his calling. It began with small things that could have been ordinary forgetfulness. Thomas misplacing his measuring tape 3 times in the same afternoon, then laughing it off with the familiar warmth that had built Oliver's childhood into something sturdy. He boiled water and forgot the tea. He started telling the story about teaching Oliver to ride the old blue bicycle, and halfway through paused as if the words had wandered off to find their own ending. The changes were gentle enough to pass unnoticed by casual observers, but their very gentleness made them feel like morning fog, every familiar shape slightly altered at the edges, transformed in ways that were beautiful and heartbreaking simultaneously. Maya noticed first, the way wives do in the space between one conversation and the next, where Thomas would search for a word that had always come easily. Oliver felt it in the dream meadow before anyone spoke the diagnosis aloud, watching his father's section begin to loop back on itself, memories appearing twice in different light, familiar pathways becoming circular rather than linear. The neurologist's office held the particular hush that accompanies unchangeable news. When she spoke the words early onset Alzheimer's, they settled into the small consultation room, like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples that would touch every shore of their shared life. Thomas stared at his hands as if they were tools he had loaned out long ago and just received back, slightly different but still recognizably his. Maya nodded with that brave softness Oliver had always known in her, already beginning the internal reorganization that love requires when circumstances shift beyond recognition. Luna squeezed Oliver's shoulder beneath the fluorescent lights, and later, at home, put the kettle on and didn't leave the kitchen until the tea had cooled to perfect drinking temperature. Emma arrived that evening with homemade bread and the kind of conversation that asked only yes or no questions, like stepping stones across uncertain water. The network of tenders reached across continents to offer support, their letters arriving like gentle rain during drought. Kenji sent pressed mountain flowers that retained the scent of high places. Maria shared lullabies that could comfort minds that had forgotten their own names. Amara offered prayers in languages that predated the need for specific words. In the dream meadow, Oliver discovered a landscape after earthquake, not the violent destruction that word might suggest, but the gentle disruption that comes when familiar ground shifts beneath feet that have walked the same paths for decades. Thomas's section had become a place where childhood memories served as foundation stones for adult experiences that no longer recognized their proper chronological homes. Street names drifted like dandelion seeds. The workbench where he had taught Oliver to hammer nails appeared in 3 different locations, each version carrying slightly different emotional weather. This was heartbreaking work that required every lesson Nana Rose had ever taught about tending without trying to control. Oliver learned to walk through these broken dreamscapes with infinite patience, not attempting to repair what was being lost, that was beyond any gift he possessed, but helping his father find moments of peace within the confusion. He brought anchors, the smell of cut cedar from old projects, the rhythm of their favorite radio station hummed under his breath, the taste of buttered toast cut into squares like childhood mornings. In the meadow, he built simple landmarks, a bench shaped like their porch swing, a small table with the battered thermos Thomas had carried to job sites, places to pause when memories tilted and horizons shifted without warning. Nights brought new forms of tending. Sometimes Thomas woke at 2 in the morning and dressed for work, his tie slightly crooked, certain that the day had begun without him. Oliver would meet him in the hallway and offer toast, as if breakfast were meant for stars rather than sun, humming the old radio jingle his father liked, until the urgency uncoiled, and sleep found its way back into the room like a cat returning to a favorite windowsill. His humming became less melody and more steady lantern, an audible handrail along increasingly unfamiliar staircases. There were hard days when doors forgot which rooms they led to, when sentences wandered off and never returned home. But the garden helped, offering its reliable rhythms when human memory grew unreliable. Moonflowers opened precisely on schedule, white as quiet answers. Evening primrose lifted their small suns to approaching dusk with clockwork certainty. Thomas would stand at the window with Oliver, naming the flowers he remembered, and when names slipped away like water through cupped hands, they would simply watch them breathe together, finding peace in shared presence rather than shared understanding. Through this season of letting go, Oliver discovered that his gift extended far beyond helping people find rest to helping them navigate the most profound transitions human beings face. His work was teaching him that some forms of tending required releasing outcomes, offering presence without expecting recognition, loving without needing to be remembered in return. When Thomas could no longer recognize faces, but still responded to familiar voices, Oliver would sit beside his bed and hum the wordless melodies that had begun in his own infancy, watching his father's breathing grow peaceful, his expression settling into the profound calm that comes when the struggle to understand finally releases into acceptance. This experience was reshaping Oliver's understanding of his calling in ways no textbook or distant client could have accomplished. He learned that dream tending was not just about bringing order to chaos, but about honoring the inherent dignity of every human experience, even when that experience involved profound loss and gentle fading. The man who had built tree houses with patient precision was teaching his son through his very forgetting that love was not diminished by memory loss, but transformed into something that required different expressions, presence instead of conversation, touch instead of words, the sacred act of witnessing someone's journey toward whatever peace awaited, beyond the boundaries of individual, remembering the profound lessons Thomas had taught through his gentle forgetting settled into Oliver's understanding like seeds finding fertile ground after winter's patient preparation. Caring for his father had transformed Oliver's gift from something he offered to others into something that lived in the very quality of his presence, deeper, more spacious, carrying the hard-won wisdom that comes from loving without needing to fix, from tending without trying to control outcomes. As spring returned to the clinic's garden, where moonflowers continued their nightly ritual of opening to receive starlight, Oliver felt a quiet stirring that had nothing to do with his own healing practice and everything to do with sharing what he had learned. Marcus arrived on an evening when the air carried the green promise of new growth, not as a client, but as someone whose own journey had led him full circle back to Oliver's gentle orbit. The boy who had once struggled with reading in elementary school now moved through the world with the quiet confidence of someone who had transformed his challenges into deeper understanding. He worked as a librarian, he explained, sitting in the sunroom as twilight painted the windows in watercolor washes, but increasingly found himself drawn to the spaces between books, the silences that held as much meaning as words, the way certain people seemed to carry calm like others carried keys or coins, I keep thinking about those lunch periods under the oak tree, Marcus said, his hands resting open in his lap with the particular stillness of someone who had learned to listen with his whole being. How you never tried to fix anyone's problems, but somehow people left feeling like their problems had become manageable. I want to learn that. Not just for myself, but to offer it to others. Oliver recognized the calling in Marcus's voice, the same quiet certainty that had guided his own path from humming infant to dream tender. The teaching that evolved between them was nothing like conventional education, but rather the patient modeling Nana Rose had offered decades before. They spent hours in the garden, watching how evening primrose chose their moment to unfurl, learning patience from flowers that understood darkness as invitation rather than ending. Oliver shared the fundamental rule that had guided all his work: never force, only invite. Marcus discovered his own unique expression of tending through what he called rhythmic anchoring. Not Oliver's gentle humming, but a subtle tapping with 2 fingers against his chest that created steady, reassuring patterns. When he practiced this simple rhythm while sitting with volunteer clients, something extraordinary happened. His presence seemed to absorb ambient anxiety, creating pockets of deep quiet wherever he settled. People found their racing thoughts naturally slowing to match his patient tempo, their breathing deepening without conscious effort. The breakthrough came during Marcus's first supervised session with Eleanor, a teacher whose mind had forgotten how to stop preparing lessons even in sleep. As Marcus sat quietly nearby, his fingers creating their gentle rhythm over his heart, the room filled with the same spacious calm Oliver remembered from his own early experiences in the dream meadow. Elena's shoulders released tensions she hadn't realized she was carrying, and when sleep finally found her, it arrived not as dramatic collapse but as natural settling, like leaves finding their place after gentle wind. That night, Oliver witnessed Marcus's section of the dream meadow for the first time, not a copy of his own grassland landscape, but something uniquely suited to Marcus's gift. Small stones appeared wherever his steady rhythm touched the ground, creating pathways across anxious territories, bridges over troubled waters that allowed safe passage without forcing change. The tradition was continuing, growing, finding new expressions in each new tender, while honoring the ancient wisdom that connected them all. The sacred art of helping others remember their own capacity for peace. As the evening deepened around them, and the garden filled with its familiar symphony of settling leaves and distant owls, Oliver felt the profound satisfaction of seeds planted in fertile ground. The work would continue long after his own hands grew still, carried forward by Marcus and others, who would discover their own ways of tending to the world's deep need for rest, one gentle breath at a time. The satisfaction of watching Marcus discover his own path as a dream tender was still settling into Oliver's understanding, like morning dew finding its place on familiar petals when Luna brought him news that would transform their quiet practice in ways neither had anticipated. She appeared in the doorway of the sunroom with a quality of light around her that seemed to come from within, her hands resting gently over her abdomen in a gesture so natural it took Oliver's breath away before he understood its meaning. "There's another heartbeat in this room," she whispered, taking his hands and placing them just below her ribs, where the faintest flutter lived like a secret, waiting to be shared. Oliver felt it immediately, not sound so much as rhythm, a small tidal motion that made his humming rise instinctively to meet it, the way water leans toward the moon. The news moved through him like dawn, not a blaze but a widening light that found every corner of his being and warmed it gently. Pregnancy taught Oliver new dimensions of tending he had never imagined possible. Luna's medical mind knew the practical rituals of nutrients and careful monitoring, while her body instructed them both in subtler forms of listening that went beyond anything textbooks could describe. At night, Oliver would sit with her in the moonlit sunroom, humming not to change anything but simply to welcome, to say without words, "We're here, we're ready, you're loved." Sometimes the baby would flutter in response, a small fish turning in clear water, and Oliver understood he was already in conversation with the soul preparing for its earthly journey. In the dream meadow, something extraordinary appeared, a cradle-shaped hollow lined with soft grasses that glowed faintly, as if lit from within by memories not yet lived. Oliver found himself drawn to this tender space night after night, not to tend in his usual way, but simply to keep watch, a quiet sentinel in an orchard before blossom. When his gentle hum flowed near, the grasses shivered with contentment beyond words, and somewhere in the waking world, Luna's breathing would deepen, the baby's rhythm settling into an unhurried swing that spoke of perfect safety. The network of dream tenders reached toward them with bright threads of blessing that arrived like gifts carried on gentle wind. Kenji sent a lullaby that sounded like snow falling on cedar, its phrasing so patient it made time widen. Maria mailed a small singing bowl the color of dawn, inscribed with spirals that caught light like promises. Even Emma, who had become a second home in their lives again, appeared with star-shaped cookies that tasted like childhood summers, and declared with characteristic firmness, "Some architecture demands snacks." Word of their expanding practice had begun to reach medical communities beyond their quiet town, bringing invitations to share Oliver's methods with sleep specialists who were discovering that healing often required more than pharmaceutical precision. But these possibilities felt distant compared to the immediate miracle unfolding within Luna. The way their daughter was already responding to the rhythms of rest and waking, learning the language of peace before she had words for anything else. As Oliver felt the baby's movements grow stronger beneath his palm, he understood with profound clarity that his gift was not something he owned but something he could pass on, not as burden but as inheritance, a legacy of peace that would ripple forward through generations like moonflowers, opening to receive starlight, each bloom making the next one possible. Hope arrived during a gentle rainstorm that reminded Oliver of his own birth, the soft percussion of water against windows, creating the same hushed reverence that had welcomed him into the world decades before. Her first sound wasn't a cry but a quiet sigh that harmonized perfectly with her father's humming, as if she had been listening to his voice through months of preparation and was simply acknowledging their formal introduction. With the wisdom of someone who already understood the language of peace, Luna held her with the reverent wonder of someone cradling a miracle wrapped in the ordinary mystery of new life. And Oliver felt something shift in the deepest chambers of his heart, not just the expansion of love he had expected, but the profound recognition that his gift had found its most sacred expression in this tiny being who carried the future of their work in her sleeping breath. The house transformed around Hope's presence the way it had once adjusted to Oliver's infant humming, but with deeper resonance now, 3 generations of tending, creating harmonies that seemed to tune the very air itself. When she fussed, Oliver's gentle hum would rise to meet her distress, not to silence it but to offer companionship, and her cries would soften into something more like conversation than complaint. Even as a newborn, Hope seemed to understand the sacred work her parents did, often falling asleep in Oliver's arms during sessions, her tiny body a living testament to the peace he offered. As Hope grew from newborn to infant, it became clear that she had inherited the family gift, but expressed it in her own unique way. Where Oliver worked through sound and presence, Hope's tending manifested through touch. Her small hands seemed to carry unusual warmth that could calm distressed animals and soothe crying babies with a gentleness that transcended ordinary infant reflexes. When their golden retriever would whine during thunderstorms, Hope's small palm against his fur would quiet his anxiety with remarkable consistency. Visiting clients often remarked how peaceful their own children became in Hope's presence, as if she emanated some quality of deep safety that needed no words to communicate itself. The invitations from medical communities had begun as soft inquiries passed along by people who had been touched by the clinic's quiet work, an email from a hospital sleep lab, a phone call from a hospice nurse who had heard Luna speak, a folded note from Dr. Sarah Chen asking if Oliver might share, gently, how presence could be taught without becoming performance. Oliver and Luna answered slowly, the way moonflowers open, never rushed, always with consent and intention, always with Hope's needs as their primary consideration. Their first pilot program unfolded in a hospital ward where worry rose like tide after visiting hours ended. Oliver didn't arrive as an expert with solutions, but like someone offering to sit quietly with whatever needed witnessing. He matched breath with preoperative patients who hadn't slept for days, offered the barest thread of humming when invitation was felt rather than heard, and watched as monitors registered what hearts already knew, that healing often began with the simple recognition that someone cared enough to stay present through the difficult hours. Word traveled in the unflashy way good news prefers, through whispered conversations between nurses who noticed that patients receiving presence rounds asked less often for pharmaceutical fixes and more often for the gentlest forms of comfort. When Oliver spoke at regional conferences, he did so with the same soft attention he brought to individual sessions, often beginning by simply humming, until restless auditoriums settled into curious quiet, then sharing stories of star-shaped sandwiches and stubborn moonflowers rather than protocols or procedures. Luna, steady as lighthouse beacon, established the boundaries that kept their expanding work honest. Small cohorts only, always paired with medical care, never replacing it. Consent as a living practice renewed in every interaction. They traveled sparingly, because Hope's presence had become integral to their understanding of how healing happened, her quiet companionship, creating layers of calm that penetrated deeper than either parent could achieve alone. The quiet revolution Oliver represented was not about replacing medical treatment, but about remembering the healing power of witnessed presence, the ancient wisdom that some forms of medicine worked through relationship rather than intervention. As their practice evolved to serve wider communities while remaining rooted in the simple truth Nana Rose had taught beneath the apple tree, Hope's development reminded them daily that this gift was not ending with their generation but evolving, finding new expressions that would serve whatever needs the future might bring. On warm evenings, as Oliver and Luna walked the garden paths with Hope sleeping against her father's chest, counting moonflowers as they exhaled into luminous being, the world felt larger but not louder, threads of care stretching from clinic to clinic, heart to heart, creating a web of small kindnesses strong enough to hold the weight of many sleepless dawns. The work was spreading like seeds carried on gentle wind, taking root wherever people remembered that tending to each other's rest was one of the most sacred forms of love, and that peace was not a private possession, but a shared resource, offered freely to a world that had forgotten how to sleep without fear. The network that had begun with whispered letters and shared dreams across continents grew the way evening primrose opens, not through force or urgency, but with the patient certainty of something whose time has finally arrived. As Hope learned to walk among the moonflowers, her small hands trailing along their white petals with instinctive reverence, Oliver found himself stepping into a role he had never sought but somehow always been preparing for. The gentle steward of a movement that was becoming larger than any individual practice while remaining rooted in the simplest human truth that we all need help finding our way to. Yes, the transformation happened gradually. Like seasons changing in Nana Rose's garden, what had once been informal correspondence between scattered tenders evolved into something more structured, though Oliver insisted it remain as organic as possible. The first formal gathering took place in their clinic's garden during autumn, when the air carried the green promise of approaching winter mixed with the eternal fragrance of night-blooming jasmine. Kenji arrived from Japan, with pressed mountain flowers and stories of sleep temples, rising in cities where concrete had forgotten how to breathe. Maria brought recordings that made water remember how to flow in perfect spirals, while Amara carried lullabies passed down through generations of women who understood that singing children to sleep was a form of prayer. Hope, now a bright-eyed toddler, who moved through their expanding world with characteristic calm, had become the living embodiment of what their work could accomplish. Her gift for soothing through touch had grown more pronounced. Visiting service dogs would settle into profound rest when she was near, and even the most anxious clients found their breathing deepening in her presence. Oliver watched how rooms adjusted to her energy, how conversations grew gentler and silences more spacious, and understood that she represented not just the future of their calling, but its essential nature. Healing that happened through relationship rather than technique. The training programs they developed grew like careful gardens, each cohort small enough for genuine connection, but large enough to create community. Marcus had become Oliver's first formal student, his rhythmic anchoring technique now helping dozens of restless sleepers find their way to peace. Elena, the teacher whose mind had once raced without pause, returned as both testament and guide, her own transformation offering hope to others still struggling with the tyranny of thoughts that wouldn't settle. Even Lily, the grieving child from Mr. Hartwell's classroom, appeared as a university student, drawn back to the work that had once helped her navigate. Lost. Luna's medical expertise ensured that their expansion maintained the ethical boundaries that protected both tenders and those they served. She developed protocols that honored the sacred trust people placed in their presence, while ensuring that serious medical conditions received appropriate treatment. "We invite, never insist," became their guiding principle, written not as rigid law, but as gentle reminder that the most profound healing often happened in the spaces between intervention and witness. The work spread with the persistence of seeds carried on patient wind, finding fertile ground in hospitals, where presence rounds began to complement traditional care. In hospices where families learned to navigate sacred transitions with greater peace, and in communities where people remembered that tending to each other's rest was one of the most ancient forms of love. Each new tender brought their own cultural wisdom, their unique expression of the universal need to help others find sanctuary in sleep. As Oliver stood in the garden one evening, watching Hope chase fireflies, while the first evening primrose opened their yellow faces to approaching dusk, he felt the profound satisfaction of seeds planted in fertile ground. The quiet revolution was no longer his alone. It belonged to everyone who understood that peace was not a private possession, but a shared resource, offered freely to a world that had forgotten how to sleep without fear. One gentle breath at a time, Hope's gifts unfurled the way moonflowers do, quietly, with a timing that belonged to them alone, revealing themselves not through sound like her father's humming, but through the gentle warmth that seemed to flow from her small hands like invisible streams of comfort. By the time she turned 4, her touch had become something neighbors whispered about with reverent wonder. How crying babies would settle when she rested her palm against their tiny backs. How anxious pets would release their trembling when her fingers found their fur. How even the most restless visitors to the clinic would leave with lighter steps after her brief, innocent contact. Oliver and Luna shaped their daughter's understanding with the same patient wisdom Nana Rose had once offered, teaching Hope that her gift was meant to serve others, but should never become a burden she carried alone. They developed gentle rituals around consent, creating a game called Asking Hands, where Hope learned to pause before touching anyone, waiting for the small nod or spoken invitation that made her healing welcome rather than intrusive. When the world's emotions felt too overwhelming, threatening to pull her into currents deeper than a child should navigate, they taught her hands in pockets, a simple gesture that helped her remember the boundary between her own feelings and those of others. The breakthrough that revealed the true depth of Hope's abilities came on an autumn afternoon, when a young teacher arrived at the clinic, her entire body vibrating with anxiety that seemed to hum beneath her skin like trapped electricity. She spoke in breathless fragments about sleepless nights and racing thoughts that wouldn't quiet, her hands shaking as Luna offered tea and Oliver settled into his familiar presence nearby. But it was Hope, now 5 and tall for her age, who approached with the careful attention they had taught her, looking first to her parents for permission, then to the woman herself. "May I?" Hope asked softly, her small hand hovering near the teacher's forearm. When the woman nodded through her tears, Hope's palm settled against her skin with the gentleness of snow landing on still water. The effect was immediate and profound. The woman's rapid breathing deepened into long, shuddering exhales, the restless energy draining from her body like water finding its level. Tears came, not of sadness but of release, and in that moment, Oliver understood that his daughter carried not simply an extension of his gift, but something entirely her own. In the dream meadow, Hope's section had revealed itself as a series of shallow tide pools scattered under an evening sky, each pool holding ripples of emotion that spread in silver rings across still surfaces. When she knelt and pressed one finger to the water, the rings would slow, widen, become gentler waves that lapped against invisible shores with the patience of eternal tides. Oliver watched from a respectful distance during his first shared journey to this landscape, recognizing that his role was shifting from active tender to witness and guide. The network of dream tenders that had grown across continents reached toward Hope with threads of recognition and blessing. Letters arrived carrying pressed flowers and lullabies from other cultures, where children learned early that healing hands were sacred gifts requiring both reverence and responsibility. Kenji sent smooth stones from mountain streams, while Maria shared recordings of water, finding its way to perfect stillness, each offering a piece of the vast tapestry that connected all who served the world's need for rest. As Hope learned to balance her extraordinary sensitivity with the ordinary joys of childhood, collecting acorns, building blanket kingdoms, learning constellation names from Thomas during his clearer moments, Oliver felt the profound satisfaction of watching ancient wisdom find new expression. The work would continue through hands smaller, but no less capable than his own, carried forward by touch that felt like home, one gentle connection at a time. Years folded over themselves the way quilts do when evening comes, edges meeting edges in quiet order, and Oliver found that his days began to carry the gentle weight of ripeness. He did not notice the moment he became an elder in the work. It arrived the way moonlight does on long summer evenings. First a suggestion on the horizon, then a soft widening across everything that needed it. His hair silvered at the temples like moonlight caught in familiar places, and his movements acquired the deliberate grace that comes from decades of tending to others with infinite patience. Hope, now approaching her teenage years with the quiet wisdom that seemed to run in their family like a gentle river, had learned to navigate her gift with increasing sophistication. Her healing touch had evolved beyond simple comfort to something more nuanced. She could sense the specific quality of distress someone carried and adjust her response accordingly. For those weighted down by grief, her hands offered the patient warmth of sun-warmed stones. For minds racing with anxiety, her touch felt cool and spacious as mountain air. Each interaction taught her more about the vast spectrum of human need and her unique capacity to meet it with precisely the right quality of presence. The garden had become a living library of healing wisdom, each plant chosen not just for beauty, but for the particular lesson it offered. Evening primrose taught patience, opening only when conditions were precisely right. Moonflowers demonstrated trust, unfurling their white petals in darkness without guarantee that light would return. Night-blooming jasmine showed how fragrance could carry comfort across vast distances, reaching hearts that hands could never touch. Oliver spent more time among these teachers, sitting on the bench beneath the apple tree with a small notebook, recording moments that had no place in medical journals, but belonged to the lineage he loved. His humming had become quieter, almost transparent, less a sound than a quality of space that appeared when he entered a room. The clinic had shifted into steady rhythm under Luna's careful stewardship, while Marcus trained new cohorts with unhurried confidence. Training centers had opened in cities where concrete had forgotten how to breathe, staffed by those who carried the work forward with their own expressions of the ancient art. People began seeking Oliver out not for treatment, but for the kind of conversation that offered permission to say true things without urgency. He wrote in the evenings, not manuals or guides, but a collection of stories and reflections. How Emma had taught him that friendship could be a form of tending, how Thomas had shown him that love continued even when memory failed, how Hope was discovering that healing could flow through the simplest touch when offered with pure intention. These writings were not for publication in the conventional sense, but for future tenders, a quiet legacy like seeds held in cupped hands, waiting for the right soil and season to unfurl. The network that had begun with whispered letters between scattered tenders had grown into something resembling a living constellation, points of light connected by invisible threads of shared purpose. Kenji's Highland clinics where snow taught a different kind of silence, Maria's riverside rooms where sound moved like water, Amara's community circles where lullabies braided neighbors into family, each adding their own notes to the eternal symphony of peace. At home, Thomas's world had narrowed into smaller, softer rooms. Some days he remembered Oliver's name. Other days he smiled as if greeting a kind stranger he liked immediately. They watched birds together at the feeder and counted evening primroses as they opened, each bloom a small ceremony that required no explanation. When words grew slippery, Oliver hummed and Thomas tapped his fingers along the armrest in slow agreement, two old rhythms finding each other without needing to be exact. In the dream meadow, Oliver's section had transformed into a vast, luminous garden filled with memory flowers, much like Nana Rose's had become in her final days. But his garden was expansive, holding the fragrant blooms of every soul he had ever helped find rest, each petal shimmering with the particular peace they had discovered. He walked among them not to tend, but to witness the beauty of a life dedicated to the quiet art of helping others find their way home to themselves. His own dreams became increasingly luminous, filled with all the people he had helped find rest over the decades. He felt himself becoming part of the great network of peace that connected all sleeping minds, a node in the infinite web of shared rest and mutual care. And as his days thinned into a quieter weave, he began to notice a new light gathering at the edge of his dreams, as if the meadow itself were rearranging its paths for a journey he did not yet need to take, but would one day walk with the same steady grace he asked of others, knowing that the work would continue long after his own hands grew still, carried forward by Hope and Marcus and countless others who understood that tending to each other's dreams was one of the most sacred forms of love, the shift from active practice to gentle. Mentorship came as naturally as seasons changing in Nana Rose's garden, each transition marked not by dramatic moments, but by the quiet accumulation of small adjustments that felt like breathing. Oliver found himself drawn to the early morning hours, when night-blooming flowers still held their luminous faces, open to fading stars, while the garden prepared for another day of patient teaching. His humming had evolved into something even more subtle, not sound so much as a quality of presence that seemed to tune the very air around him, creating pockets of deep quiet wherever he settled. Hope, now 17 and moving through the world with her mother's precision and her father's intuitive wisdom, had become his most trusted companion in these dawn vigils. Together they would count the evening primrose that had chosen this particular morning to complete their earthly blooming. Her healing touch now refined enough to sense not just distress, but the exact quality of peace someone was ready to receive. She could offer the patient warmth of sun-heated stones to those weighted by grief, or the cool spaciousness of mountain air to minds racing with anxiety, each interaction teaching her more about the vast spectrum of human need. The ceremony happened without planning, the way all important things seem to unfold in their lives. One autumn evening, as twilight painted the garden in watercolor washes, and the first evening primrose lifted their yellow faces toward approaching darkness, Oliver appeared on the porch carrying Thomas's old cedar box, a small chest that still carried the faint scent of sawdust and careful craftsmanship. Inside lay the quiet tools of his calling: Nana Rose's worn trowel, a smooth river stone from Kenji, Maria's dawn-colored singing bowl, and a folded paper bearing his careful handwriting. Never force, only invite. Hope, Marcus, and several of the newer tenders gathered in the garden without invitation, drawn by the same instinct that had always guided their work. Luna stood beside Oliver, her arm linked through his as if to share the weight of sacred moments, while Emma arrived with star-shaped sandwiches, laughing that important ceremonies required proper snacks. They formed a loose circle among the moonflowers, no program or speeches needed, just the hush that arrives when people understand they're witnessing something that will echo forward through generations. Oliver placed Nana Rose's trowel in Hope's hands, watching her fingers close around the handle with the ease of someone who already knew its weight and purpose. To Marcus went the dawn-colored bowl, its rim catching twilight like a sustained note held without strain. The river stone found its way to Layla, a young tender who had traveled across continents to be present, while the folded paper with its gentle rule was offered to all of them at once, seeds to be tucked into pockets, and hearts where such wisdom takes root best. Thomas sat nearby in Maya's soft cardigan, his gaze moving from flower to face, with the tentative focus of someone navigating a familiar room that had rearranged itself just enough to feel dreamlike. When Hope knelt beside him and pressed her warm hand over his, something in his expression steadied. "You," he said, the single word holding universes of recognition, and she answered with a smile he could hold on to like an anchor in shifting currents. That night in the dream meadow, Oliver witnessed something extraordinary, streams of different landscapes converging where his familiar grassland had always been. Kenji's highland paths, Maria's river spirals, Amara's acacia-shadowed clearings, all flowing together into a luminous confluence that sparkled like starlight on moving water. The work was no longer his alone, but belonged to everyone who understood that tending to each other's rest was one of the most ancient forms of love, spreading like seeds carried on patient wind to wherever they were needed most. Morning brought the familiar comfort of Luna's hand around his and the kettle's gentle whisper, the house holding its old habit of leaning toward peace. Oliver spent the day writing in his notebook, not instructions but invitations, stories of star-shaped sandwiches and stubborn moonflowers, observations about how healing happened in the spaces between one breath and the next. These pages would become quiet legacy, held like cupped hands around flame, waiting for future tenders who would need reminding that the most profound gifts often grew from the simplest human connections. One gentle presence at a time, Oliver's final years unfolded with the same gentle attention to transition that had characterized his entire practice, each day settling like evening light across familiar landscape. His notebook lay open most afternoons, filled with observations that belonged to no medical journal, but carried the weight of lived wisdom. We don't fix the night, we befriend it. The pages held fragments of understanding gathered like pressed flowers. How Emma had taught him that friendship could be a form of tending. How Thomas had shown him that love continued even when memory failed. How Hope was discovering that healing could flow through the simplest touch when offered with pure intention. The garden had become his primary teacher, evening primrose opening precisely on schedule, while moonflowers unfurled their white trumpets to receive starlight, each bloom a small ceremony requiring no explanation beyond its own luminous being. Hope moved among these quiet teachers with the natural grace of someone who had never known a world without sacred work. Her healing touch now recognized across continents, not as performance, but as the profound gift of presence made tangible. Her warm hands carried the accumulated wisdom of years, patient as sun-heated stones for those weighted by grief, cool as mountain streams for minds racing with anxiety, steady as eternal tides for hearts learning to trust rest again. The network of dream tenders had evolved into something resembling a living constellation, each point of light connected by invisible threads of shared purpose. Marcus led training programs with his rhythmic anchoring technique, helping new tenders discover their own expressions of ancient wisdom. Emma's architectural projects now breathed peace into concrete landscapes, creating spaces where rest could find its natural home, even in bustling cities. Kenji's Highland clinics, Maria's riverside rooms, Amara's community circles, all serving the same essential purpose of helping people remember their capacity for peace. On his final evening, Oliver sat beneath the apple tree, as twilight painted the sky in watercolor washes, Luna's hand steady in his, Hope humming the wordless melodies he had taught her since infancy. Thomas slept peacefully nearby, his breathing shallow but calm, fingers still tapping gentle rhythms even in dreams. Emma arrived with star-shaped sandwiches and tears that knew how to be soft, while Marcus kept his patient tempo, creating bridges of sound across the space between staying and leaving. When sleep arrived, Oliver didn't chase it, but greeted it like an old friend whose timing was perfect. In the dream meadow, landscapes he had known by heart converged in luminous recognition. Kenji's high places, Maria's bright rivers, Amara's shade-laced circles, meeting where a cradle-shaped hollow glowed with memory of all beginnings. He felt himself not leaving but loosening, his humming unlatching from the boundaries of breath and widening into the quiet undercurrent that would flow through other people's rooms. The calm beneath a nurse's night rounds, the soft thread inside a child's fever dream. His passing was as gentle as his living, a gradual fading into the great sleep that connects all dreams, his presence merging with the vast network of peace that held all sleeping minds in its tender embrace. But his humming didn't stop. It simply became part of the background music of the universe, joining the eternal lullaby that rocks the cosmos to sleep each night. Hope and the other tenders he had trained continued the work, each adding their own notes to the symphony of peace that would ripple forward through generations like moonflowers opening to receive starlight. The quiet war continued, fought not with weapons but with presence, not with force but with the endless, patient work of helping each other find peace. And somewhere, in the space between sleeping and waking where dreams take root and grow, Oliver's essence lives on, a gentle reminder that we are all connected in our need for rest, and that tending to each other's dreams is one of the most sacred forms of love. One soft breath at a time, forever and always. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay.